Welcome to another NBS show. Today, we'll be interviewing Pierce, TNP's newest Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and Communications. Since he only recently became active in the North Pacific, many nations may want to know more about his background and experience. This interview will attempt to answer those questions. Welcome to the show, Pierce.
Thank you for having me.
Given your nation's population, it would seem as if you've only been on nation states for just a couple of years. Is that true?
Well, I've been here a little over 3 years. I realized it looking back at my dates just now. I first arrived in the Social Liberal Union, and then I just moved around different regions, took on different positions, and just to gain some of that experience over time.
I mean, that's a very humble way of putting it. I would say that you have an impressive resume for someone who's only been here for that long. I mean, 3.5 years is still decent enough, but I mean, from the executive staff application, it states that you've spent some time in, as you already mentioned, Social Liberal Union, but also
hmm
Kingdom of Great Britain, and then Europea before joining the North Pacific. And it wasn't just low-level staffing positions. It says you've been delegate of SLU, that you've served as prime minister. So I'm gonna start off by talking about the time spent in the Social Liberal Union. But we're gonna try to run through these as well because I just want to know more about your background. So, could you talk a little bit about what made you decide to join the Social Liberal Union and how you went about gaining experience, including how you ultimately ascended to the delegacy?
Well, at the time, 2017, just a year after the 2016 election in real life. So I wanted to join a region when I joined this game among like-minded individuals politically. So I started there. I believe my very first position there was actually Deputy Minister of Immigration. And then, a lot of people at the time, they were older members, and they were looking for newcomers to take on further positions. So I gained a lot of legislative experience there, some executive here and there helping out. And then finally, in March of 2017, I ran and won as delegate of SLU. There's not a lot I remember about that time because it's been so long and so much has happened since then. But my term as delegate ended in October 2017, so it was quite a long time. That was 2 terms as delegate. And then after that, I served as chancellor there. I don't know if I put that in my application, but I served as chancellor, which is their equivalent of the chief justice of their regional court. So that was from October 2017 to January 2018. And that is the region where I met Ghost. He was either a citizen there or he was just there as a diplomat. I can't remember. But I had heard about the North Pacific at the time. And, since it was such a big region, it was a little intimidating. So I haven't joined until recently.
What made you decide to leave the Social Liberal Union for the Kingdom of Great Britain?
Well, it was a variety of factors. One was with political opinions. There were a lot of differences with that, and then differences with leadership approach. So I decided to leave that. I had heard about the shadow wars in Great Britain. There's a lot of outrage, and rightfully so. So I thought that would be a chance to kind of prove myself to take on a challenge to make some reforms there under their new monarch.
Could you walk us through your time there as well?
Yeah, so I started as a low-level civil servant, and from the experience in SLU with the Interregional Legislative Coalition, which is another World Assembly type alliance like WAL, but much smaller. But I was interested in foreign affairs, so I did a lot of things in foreign affairs there. I did things with treaties. I and legislatively, I did a lot of reform bills to take on the corruption. Some of those reform bills involve, ethics. What else? It it weakened the powers of their monarchy considerably, and it made the monarch more accountable to Parliament and the people of the region in order to prevent something like the Shadow Wars from happening again.
Before
Um,
you continue, I actually haven't heard of the Shadow Wars, and I'm sure some of our other listeners haven't either. Could you go into more detail about what that was?
so the Shadow Wars, it was a few years ago. The Kingdom of Great Britain used to have this king. His real life name was Don. He went by several names throughout his reign over the Kingdom of Great Britain. The most recent one was George the Sixth, I think. And there were just a lot of things internally that was wrong. He influenced elections. It was just overall toxic. There was some OOC stuff going on as well. But with the Shadow Wars, it was the what had happened was he was planning this conflict against a bunch of other regions, including Europea, the West Pacific, among others, LKE. And he has Cephal Talleyrand as one of the planners of it. And then the planning leaked from their Privy Council, which is the quote unquote advisory body of their monarch. And that came out. There was a lot of outrage. It ended with that king abdicating after so many years of being on the throne. He was the founder of that region, actually. And then the next king, he lasted for about a month until he had to step down. I'm not completely certain still what circumstances led to that, but he was a part of that group that planned it. And then after that, the current king, King John, he had been working on reforms since then to improve KGB's image. So I rose through the ranks in Great Britain doing that.
So, when you say you worked on different types of reforms to reduce the power of the monarchy, there, you already mentioned, I think it was sort of governmental ethics, but
Hmm.
what other reforms did you work on there that reduced that power or built in transparency? Was it sort of like the Magna Carta, or a lot less significant?
It was mainly incremental. One of the changes we made directly to the powers of the monarch, and it was very hardly fought, was the way it used to be in that region. The monarch had these imperial decrees where they could not be overturned by any body. They're absolute. They're constitutional law. But after the part of the reforms that I had passed, it imperial decrees can be overturned by parliament. So that was one of the things. Another thing is we had an anti-corruption bill for their criminal code, and that added things like malfeasance, misfeasance, nonfeasance for public offices. It wasn't just for the monarchy; it was all public offices because a lot of the issues were from the top down. So we wanted to ensure that people on all levels were held accountable. And then another thing we added was freedom of information. If there are military secrets or secrets of regional interests that should be released, we included a process for releasing that information. Another thing was their intelligence agency. It made that more accountable to the elected government rather than just the monarch. And that intelligence agency had been a part of the effort under Don to do the whole Shadow Wars debacle. So made a lot of progress with that.
That's certainly quite a number of reforms. Um, so, just so that I get a little bit of a better understanding, in your citizenship, or rather your executive staff application, you also mentioned that you ultimately arose to the position of prime minister. Was that position more of a head of state, or would it be more equivalent to sort of Speaker of the Regional Assembly here in the North Pacific?
Well, it's important to distinguish the difference between a head of state and a head of government in a Westminster system like Great Britain. The king is the head of state. It's mostly ceremonial with some of its powers. And then the head of government is the prime minister. And the prime minister is like almost the equivalent of the delegacy here, where they have the power to appoint their ministers and all. So I was head of the executive civil government and in that position.
That's quite impressive. Yeah, I had meant head of government, but yeah, thank you. Um,
Hmm.
so just like you mentioned, sort of political differences and whatnot after leaving SLU, what made you decide to leave the Kingdom of Great Britain for Europea?
Well, I've been in between KGB and Europea during that time, but this final time that I finally left KGB, there are a series of circumstances that led to it. My term as prime minister, because of the various factions within the region, I was trying to have this um, leadership of bringing people together. But there are certain elements in that region with powerful personalities that made it difficult. And then the final straw when I resigned as prime minister was because of intervention by the monarch that I didn't like. What had happened was um, with the citizenship applications and the standards, there were constitutional requirements to keep citizenship. And the king wanted to make exceptions for members of the royal family, but it was it was illegal in my view because it contradicted the constitution of the region. And he told my home secretary, which is in charge of the immigration and citizenship applications, he directed her to accept it anyway, although I had said not to. Well, not accept it, but to demask someone because they did not fulfill their constitutional requirements. And I felt undermined because it's not really the monarch's place to do that in the context of a Westminster system. And so I resigned, and from there I had bad feelings about the region ever since, and I finally left.
And then I hate to ask again, but I'm really curious about your background. Could you talk a little bit, like walk us through your time in Europea? You mentioned that you had served sort of a bit concurrently there until you ultimately left KOGB, but
Hmm.
just sort of give us like the rundown of your experience in Europea as well.
Well, in Europea, I started out as a civil servant in foreign affairs because of that background. And from there, what was it? Yeah, I became a senator next, briefly in a by election. And I lost that by election to a newcomer. But shortly after that by election, there was a presidential election, and Sopo, which some of you may know because he's a long time member of nation states, but he decided to run for president, and he wanted a newcomer to run with him as vice president. And it was a big gamble because I had not held any minister positions before. So we won, and we ran for a second term and won. And then shortly after that, the Europea split into the two executives between foreign affairs and domestic affairs, and that's when I became deputy chief of state under Chief of State Karamia.
What's the
And then
role
I,
of vice president in Europea?
well, at the time, the presidency no longer exists. It'll come back eventually, but the presidency is basically the head of state and government in Europea. And then they had these executive reforms where they split the executive between the chief of state position, which is over all the foreign affairs related ministries, and then the first minister, who's over all the domestic affairs. So I was under the chief of state as their deputy.
Got it. Understood. So after roughly 3.5 years of serving in all sorts of different positions in three different but quite prominent UCRs, you definitely built up quite a bit of experience. Um, is that part of what contributed to making TNP seem sort of less intimidating? I'm just really curious. After so much time spent dwelling in UCRs, what made you ultimately decide to join a feeder, and then why did you specifically decide to join the North Pacific?
Well, the smaller regions, they are a lot less work to deal with than, bigger regions like the North Pacific. So I wanted to put my toes in the water first with the smaller regions. That way I have some experience and to kind of know what I'm talking about before interacting with the so-called big shots. So when I finally decided, it's time to join a bigger region, I was looking for a democratic region, a welcoming community. Um, One of those from the list was the West Pacific, but that's more of an autocratic, meritocratic society. So it wasn't really attractive to me because, I don't think that regions that have a powerful central executive is healthy because of the experience that I had trying to make things right in the Kingdom of Great Britain. So I wanted to join a democratic region where newcomers can be uplifted more. So that's partially why I decided to join the North Pacific.
Your history and your reasons for joining the North Pacific actually almost mirror mine. I wasn't in nearly as many UCRs, but I also rose to delegate several times in like a 250 person region. So, yeah, totally. Like, I totally get on board with that sort of welcoming atmosphere that we have cultivated here, and the democratic. Uh, it's like democratic at the upper levels when when you're running for the delegacy and whatnot, but it's meritocratic
Right.
on the lower levels so that people who have talent or ambition can really get started quite quickly.
Right. And
Um,
that balance is something that this region should be proud of. Because, I've heard a lot of people throughout my time say, oh, democracy in nation states is unsustainable. It doesn't last, but it's lasted for a long time in this region, and it doesn't seem to have any issues with it so far. So
we're living proof of its success. Yeah, we're very proud of that. So I noticed that you actually applied for citizenship like way back in May of 2019 before your more recent April 7th application of this year. Um, could
hmm
you like describe why you decided to become like more involved this time around and more committed to the region?
well, it's less intimidating now.
Right, okay.
When I applied for citizenship, that one time you mentioned, I had scrolled, I was looking around, and I was like, oh, this is above me. So I kind of shifted my focus back to Europea and the Kingdom of Great Britain a little more to cultivate more experience. And so, like I said, this time around, it felt less intimidating. I kind of have an idea of how things work from, working with people who are familiar with the North Pacific, from my experience as vice president in Europea, working with the various elements for our interest with Europea's allies like the North Pacific. So it was definitely helpful.
Soon after becoming a citizen, you applied for the ministries of Foreign Affairs, World Assembly Affairs, and Communications. Given your background, foreign affairs is certainly no surprise, but I'm sort of wondering what makes you most interested in WA and comms as well.
Well, for communications, I used to be in charge of the Kingdom of Great Britain's BBC, which is their state media outlet. So I did a lot of articles through that before. And then for the WA, I had a little bit of experience as vice president with that, but I wanted to kind of learn more into that as a new challenge um, before pursuing any other offices.
Right.
So I just want to get more knowledge with that because in some regions where the World Assembly is not a priority for their foreign policy interests, but in this region it is. So I figured, why not dip your toes in to learn a little more about it since you know you're going into the foreign affairs ministry.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And just a month later, we now see you as deputy minister in not one, but two different executive ministries, communications and foreign affairs. And first off, I would like to offer you my hearty congratulations. But I'll
Thank you.
also admit that I'm not terribly surprised, given what we just heard about each of your former positions in the UCRs. Um, so we've already discussed that you're not nearly as intimidated by TNP now as you once were, and you shouldn't be, given your vast experience in other aspects of nation states. This really shouldn't be too much of a problem for you. But what do you expect will be the most challenging aspect of each of those roles?
Well, just because it's a bigger region, I feel like there will be more time that I would have to put into this position than, equivalent positions or higher positions in the smaller regions I've been in. And I feel like learning how the World Assembly works is a challenge in itself because one of my goals is to eventually draft some resolutions, but drafting resolutions is it's not easy because you have to brainstorm ideas and figure out if they've already been covered because a couple of my ideas that I had for resolutions were already covered. So it's a part of the brainstorming process and then whipping up votes among our allies. That'll come with a job later, but that will definitely be a challenge.
Well, we're very glad to have an exceptionally capable newcomer to the region. Um, have you thought at all about what your future plans and ambitions are here? Do you ever see yourself campaigning for the delegacy, for instance?
Well, I haven't even thought about the delegacy, but depending on how things go, it could happen, it could not. We'll just see where the cards fall in.
See how it see how it comes. Yeah, take it
Hmm.
day by day.
That's right.
um, I saw you joined the North Pacific Army. Do you have any background experience in R&Ding as well? And what would you consider to be your alignment?
Well, I did. I was in the military in KGB before. Did a few missions. I was actually trained under VAC, and the training wasn't that great. So I still had a lot to learn after that. And then in Europea, as part of the job with being vice president, I was also in the ERN and gained some experience with that, but I wasn't in that for too long. So that's a part of why I joined the NPA as well to gain more experience have better training with it than than KGB. So I'm excited. There are a lot of people within the military, like Rom, who are excellent, with training and guiding people while having that patience to guide newcomers. So I'm grateful for that.
Um, how does your experience in the North Pacific so far compare with your time in the UCRs? I know you've only been here like a month, but um, I figured I'd just sort of ask to get that out of the way.
Well, I feel like it's too soon to know for sure the differences because I haven't done much yet. In order to compare the workload and the energy and time needed to dedicate to these positions. But give me another month or two and I can answer that for you.
No problem. Is there anything you'd suggest that we can improve from, the perspective of a newcomer?
I would update the guides a little bit. That's one of the things that I was going to suggest during my time here. Some of the names are outdated. We could, I think, in terms of foreign affairs, I think it'll be a really good idea as part of the World Factbook project to compile a dossier about our foreign policy history, the different alignments with our allies, with people that might be our foes. So I think those would be good improvements to make.
I certainly agree with that, and I hope that you get to those as part of your time as deputy minister within foreign affairs. Hopefully, um, Ghost is willing to help you achieve that.
Yeah, I hope so. Before he approached me about it, we had been discussing various things that we could do. The potential that foreign affairs has in the North Pacific, and I'm grateful that he shares the vision. So I'm excited to get started on that necessary work.
You mentioned having known Ghost since all the way back in SLU. Um, can you describe your relationship with him and how it's like changed over that time? Like, were you surprised to see him here in the North Pacific, or did he like invite you to join?
Well, he didn't really invite me to join. After I left SLU, we kind of dropped out of contact a little bit. And then when I rejoined, we've been talking here and there, and so it was like things never changed from back then.
Right. So you've already talked a little bit about some of your plans for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What makes you excited for your future here?
Well, like I said, the North Pacific, there's a lot of room for growth. This region is very open to newcomers. It seems to be very good at training newcomers and giving them opportunities. So I'm excited with the opportunities that come with that, and I hope to take advantage of that in order to make my mark here.
What advice would you offer for other newcomers looking to become deputy ministers themselves someday?
Um, I would say just to stay in the loop with everything that goes on in Citizens Chat. Start networking with the different leaders of the region, so that they get to know you. Put yourself out there with your history of your experience if you have any. So yeah.
And so I haven't actually seen too many questions in the Agora chat from our audience. I just want to remind them that if they want to contribute, they can ping me with a question and we'll get to those in just a bit. Um, I guess I'll start wrapping this up though with a bit of a silly question. Before we started this interview, I asked you for sort of a background image or something that I could use as a thumbnail, and you suggested using your avatar, which is Manuel Valls, who's like former French Prime Minister, something something in Barcelona. Could you describe like why you chose him to be your avatar?
Well, I have no specific reason. The reason why I've always had that is because back in KGB for avatars, we used to just use random politicians. So I just looked up a random European politician and put him in my avatar, and I've used him since.
Right. About as good
So
as reason as any. So,
yeah, no special reason there.
all right. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap this up?
I have nothing else.
All right. Well, seeing as we don't have any questions from the audience, thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this NBS special interview. Um, have a nice evening, I guess.
Good night.